Socialism has evolved throughout its history. It's gone through, utopian socialism, scientific socialism, Bolshevism, Maoism. It just keeps shifting. I mean, today the socialists like to use environmentalism as a cover, or identity politics, or something like that. It keeps shape-shifting because reality keeps imposing itself on socialism.
Socialism in America is back. Old ideas have been repackaged and rebranded with surprising success.
I think we've reached a breaking point. The socialist ideas and the anti-Western ideas, it's infiltrated everywhere. Now the chickens have come home to roost.
Black Lives Matter. Cancel culture. The redefinition of sex and gender. Calls for radical environmental reform. We're living through a period of jarring social transformation. Many of those pushing such change now unabashedly call themselves socialists. Today, socialism focuses as much on culture as it does on economics, and is as fixated on political correctness as on the proletariat. But the solution to almost every problem is still the same: more government control and less personal freedom. The arguments may sound new, but they're rooted in ideas that go back centuries.
So if you want to understand some of these arguments and put them in their context, you need to figure out where they're coming from. And if they're coming from a certain ideological perspective that is asserting that a socialist upheaval is true and desirable, it's important to understand that.
Hello, I'm Brett Baer. It has been more than 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, an event that many thought heralded the end of socialism itself. If you haven't watched Volume 1 of the Unauthorized History of Socialism on Fox Nation, I hope you will at some point. In it, we trace the rise, fall, and surprising resilience of socialism as an economic idea. But that is only half the story. As you'll find out in this series, socialism in America today is about much more than just the economy. The Green New Deal, critical race theory, gender politics, and cancel culture may seem like thoroughly 21st century issues that go far beyond economics, but all have roots in socialist arguments that go back decades or more. How these ideas evolved and changed to the point where they are now central to so much of our current debate is the story we tell in this series. And so we begin in Chicago. The year is 1893, and the Columbian Exposition has just opened. The fairgrounds are a city within a city, built on enthusiasm for the coming new century and a new America. It was a giant celebration of human achievement that marked the 400th anniversary of the arrival of Christopher Columbus in what Europeans called the New World. For its 27 million visitors, the Columbian Exposition was a window into the changes that would come in the next century. And like a giant department store where everything is bigger and better, the fair showcased the future, along with the faith that progress could be measured and managed. Even something as abstract as beauty could be quantified and improved. Scientists compiled the measurements of 40,000 college students, and artists used these statistics to create statues of the ideal man and the perfect woman. It was the dawn of progressivism, a philosophy built on the idea that enlightened government bureaucrats now had the science and the tools to shape society for the common good.
Well, what was progressivism? Some of it was an impulse to do better. Some of it was the idea that by applying scientific knowledge, by being serious about what you're doing, by having serious civil servants who are there to work and not just because they have a job through a favor, and government will get a better outcome. Government's not wrong as long as it's not corrupt.
I think we can think of progressivism as, to coin a phrase, socialism with American characteristics. There were some particularly American ideas that were circulating around the time in the 1890s. And so when it came to the challenges of the time, progressivism was as egalitarian as Marxist, but it also allowed room for individual initiative. So market economy was a good thing, but it had to be controlled. It had to be controlled for the good of the collective, for the good of the people. And that's what led America down a slightly different path than the socialism of Europe.
At the center of the exposition was the so-called White City, new buildings with grand facades, all built in the neoclassical style. At night, thousands of incandescent lamps lit up the grounds, a preview of how electrification would soon transform the country. Visitors could take it all in by riding on a new attraction, the Ferris wheel, one of the many technological marvels introduced at the fair. Progress was all around, promising a new and better future. But outside the confines of the White City, America was changing, and in the view of progressives, not in a positive way.
At the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, progressives were confronting a society that seemed out of control to them. You had monopolies growing vastly and lots of rich people and that kind of thing. There were millions and millions of immigrants pouring into the country from all over, mostly Europe at the time. And they seemed to be un-American, untrained, uneducated, not suited for democracy. And so this, from the progressive point of view, needed more scientific management, more top-down control, because all of these things were tearing the country apart, essentially.
The idea of top-down control was essential to American progressives. So much so that progress itself was equated with larger and more powerful government. Just outside the Chicago Fairground, one of the great promoters of the day, William Cody, was staging a production of his own. 3 times a day, Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show celebrated gunslinging cowboys, Indian warriors, and brave settlers. For a new generation, this was as close as they would ever come to the American frontier. For even as Buffalo Bill put tales of the heroic West on parade, a young professor declared that the frontier was in fact closed. Frederick Jackson Turner, a progressive historian from the fledgling University of Wisconsin, presented his thoughts to the American Historical Association. His thesis would come to be called the single most influential piece of writing in the history of American history.
Frederick Jackson Turner is an American historian. It's often associated with the progressive era, but he's writing roughly in about the 1890s. And he has an observation, basically says that up until that point in history, the American frontier, the vast undeveloped land of the interior of the country, had served essentially as a safety valve for economic pressures. If you were down on your luck, you were facing social discord, all you had to do was head out west.
According to Turner, the closing of the frontier marked the end of the first chapter of the American story. He believed that the experience of forging a nation out of the wilderness created character traits that were uniquely American. Turner wrote, "Coarseness and strength, acuteness and inquisitiveness, that restless, nervous energy, that dominant individualism which comes with freedom, these are the traits of the frontier. This expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnishes the forces dominating American character." Turner based his conclusions about the American character on data collected by the US government. Statistics revealed truths that would help experts direct the future.
In 1890, the US Census Bureau very famously declares that the frontier has been settled. We have settlements on both coasts of the United States. There's a transcontinental railroad. The interior of the country is developed. And Frederick Jackson Turner is looking at this and saying, this is going to change the social equation.
In the United States, a lot of things were happening. Huge amount of urbanization. Immigration was in full flood at that time. And then, of course, you had the closing of the frontier, where basically people could no longer escape to the countryside and build their own lives. And instead, we're going to be living in cities and working in factories and that kind of thing.
For Turner, the frontier had meant social and economic freedom, and he worried that with its closing, America would become more like Europe. He wrote, "The transformations through which the United States is passing in our own day are so profound, so far-reaching, that it is hardly an exaggeration to say that we are witnessing the birth of a new nation in America." The revolution in social and economic structure of this country during the past 2 decades is comparable to what occurred when independence was declared and the Constitution was formed, or to the changes wrought by the era which began half a century ago, the era of Civil War and Reconstruction. While Turner and other progressives saw America changing, scholars in Europe were wondering why things there had stayed so much the same. In 1848, Karl Marx had predicted that the inescapable consequence of global capitalism would be a workers' revolution, and that history-dictated socialism would emerge from the ashes of that great revolt. According to Marx, what the bourgeoisie produces, above all, are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. As his follower Karl Kautsky put it, our task is not to organize the revolution, but to organize ourselves for the revolution. It is not to make the revolution, but to take advantage of it.
According to the theories of Marx and Engels that socialists everywhere believed, the economics of capitalism should produce a socialist movement, but it wasn't happening in the United States. And then the socialists built on Turner's observation to say, well, the frontier gives the workers in America a kind of escape. Instead of their coming to see that socialism is the only answer because capitalism is exploiting them, when they felt underpaid, exploited, whatever have you, they always had the option of picking up and moving their families west. It was a version of something that then had many other versions over the subsequent century in many other places, as well as America, which was people trying, socialists trying to figure out why the beautiful, compelling theory of Marxism wasn't coming true, that its predictions and prophecies that made so much sense on paper just didn't happen in the real world.
According to Marx, there was another reason America was well behind Europe on the road to socialism.
Marx's theories resonated in Europe because Europe had a tremendous history of class. European countries had all been feudal in their structure. They had all had official class differences of lords and commoners. We never had anything like that in the United States. So when Marxism came around in the mid-1800s with this theory that everything is based on class and eventually the solution is also to be based on class, that is, the working class, the proletariat will rise up and create its own new system, new world. That didn't resonate in the United States, where there was not a sense that people had inherited class positions. And you can even find quite insightful and touching writings by Abraham Lincoln, in which he talks about what's special about America in this respect. And of course, Lincoln was not a man from the aristocracy. He was a man from the log cabin who was mostly self-educated because there was very little schooling available to him, and who had split rails. But he in his writings commented about how America was so open for individual self-advancement, a sense that was lacking in Europe. And that, I think, fit in with the observers who said, well, the frontier is what's making socialism not appeal to people in America, but I think also this sense of fluidity. So we did have progressivism. That is, we had people fighting for reforms in America. But there was always an underlying sense that the system was basically sound, and these faults or injustices could be identified and fixed within the system. Whereas there was much more appeal in Europe for Marxist solutions, which essentially said the system is the problem, the system must be overthrown in revolution, usually violent revolution. The people in power have to be crushed, and a whole new class of people has to take power in order for anything to be made right.
Marxist intellectuals would debate for decades why the global revolution predicted by Marx was behind schedule. Edward Bernstein, a German theorist, politician, and key disciple of Marx and Engels, was having doubts it would come at all.
Bernstein is a very interesting character, and really, to my mind, a much more likable character than Marx or Engels and most of those who followed. He was the third in line of the intellectual exponents of Marxism. Engels outlived Marx, and Engels carried on Marx's work after they had buried Marx. And then their leading disciple was Bernstein. And although Das Kapital is 800 turbid pages, it's only volume one of what's supposed to be a multi-volume work. I think you can say it's a great benefit to all subsequent generations of Marxists who would have had to study 4 more volumes of this, that Marx died when he did. What happened instead was that Engels took Marx's notes and produced, I believe it was 3 more volumes, but they were brief because Engels really couldn't write them with the detail and theoretical depth of Marx, even though Engels was a great pamphleteer. And then selected Bernstein to write the final volume. I cite this to cite how clearly Bernstein was sort of the third in line of Marxist theory.
Instead of continuing the work of Marx and Engels, Bernstein launched a critique of his mentor's great work, arguing that there was a different way forward. Bernstein wrote, "The Communist Manifesto was correct, but we see the privileges of the capitalist bourgeoisie yielding to democratic organizations. In my judgment, success lies in a steady, peaceful advance rather than in a catastrophic crash."
Bernstein was not so intoxicated by theory. He actually came from a proletarian family. His father was a railway worker. And he was actually much more in touch personally with working class life. And here we get to the 1880s, 1890s, and Bernstein notices in his family, in his friends, in the neighbors, in the working class neighborhood, that life is getting better. The whole theory that the proletariat would rise up and make a revolution, create a new society, hinged on this Marxian forecast that the proletariat was going to get poorer and poorer until it would have no choice. And Bernstein said, hold the presses. This ain't happening. They haven't made a revolution these 50 years since Marx and Engels first said they would, and they ain't going to.
Well, Bernstein's very much a Marxist in his own right. He comes out of the far left socialist movements. He's in correspondence with Friedrich Engels, who's Marx's co-author, and subscribes to what we'd call socialistic or communistic economic systems. But he says the means to get there must necessarily differ. We have to revise Marx. The inevitable result that's predicted by Marx of the toppling of capitalism isn't coming about through the means that he said. Instead, we need to adapt our political system to bring those conditions into existence, to actually be the agitators for political change. I think it's entirely fair to call what Bernstein wants is an evolutionary approach to socialism. Rather than there being a single upheaval or an event where the proletariats topple the capital owners, topple the bourgeois, topple the forces in power, it's a slow progression through political modifications. He actually welcomes some of the progressive ideas that are being used to ameliorate economic pressures and sees these reforms as consistent with getting society onto the path toward a socialist end.
Socialists in Europe and progressives in America seem to be coming to the same conclusion. Society's advances could be harnessed and directed, and incremental reform was possible if only they were the ones in charge of the levers of government. But a revolution in Russia and the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany forced a major change in how socialists viewed the world. Perhaps surprisingly, Southern California would become the epicenter for a new strand of socialist thought, aimed at disrupting American society at every level. That's next time on the Unauthorized History of Socialism, Volume 2. In the wake of the First World War, factories across Europe and America turned out consumer goods that improved the lives of workers. Everything from automobiles to cigarettes to beer was becoming cheaper